Hi, welcome to theAnalysis.news. I'm Paul J. We're getting near the end of the year 2021, and amongst other things, some of you are considering where to donate some year-end money you might have made or might have a little extra. We are a 501c3 charity in the United States and elsewhere. I hope you just give because you want to give. We don't have tax-exempt status anywhere else. All that being said, we can't do this without you. Your financial support, of course, is critical. I still really not getting paid anything, but I hope I will. But I have to hire I have a part-time editor. I've got a part-time admin assistant. I've got a part-time web administrator. It all costs real money in terms of the monthly payments for various kinds of subscriptions, like translation costs us money. Both the service that does the automatic transcription and paying people to proofread those, because as you know, these automatic transcriptions are only about 80% effective. So we are paying for that too. So if you're watching, if you're reading the transcripts, if you like what we do, I hope you will support the kind of work we do. I think it's unique, and I hope you do too. We will be back in just a few seconds with Andrew Cockburn and his book, The Spoils of War. There's a document from the year 2000. It's known to many as the Project for New American Century. It was signed by Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and many other neocons that made up President Bush's Cabinet and Defense Department. People usually focus on the fact that the document advocates regime change in Syria, Iraq, and eventually in Iran. And it's all about asserting American dominance, asserting its role as a single superpower after the demise of the Soviet Union. But one should pay attention to what the actual title of the document is. It's Rebuilding America's Defenses, which is all about a massive increase in military spending. Of course, it should be called Rebuilding America's Offense, but the key point is about the supposed need for creating trillions of dollars to modernize the U.S. Armed Forces. This is the document that's often cited to reference the 9/11 attacks, as it out and out says that Americans won't support such spending or another major war without another Pearl Harbor type attack on the United States. Of course, in 2001, they got what they wished for, perhaps what some of them planned for. According to Senator Bob Graham, who led the joint congressional 9/11 investigation, Bush-Cheney actually facilitated the attacks in collaboration with Saudi Arabia. More on that another time. But why is Bob Graham's position on this being ignored? The objective, we are told, was rebuilding America's armed forces, but rebuilding them for what? Well, to defend America's freedom, of course, and it doesn't take a lot of scrutiny to find out there's actually no threat to America's freedom, at least not externally. There might be quite a few threats internally, domestically, but what exactly is that freedom to begin with? It's certainly a lot more freedom for people of wealth than people who are not of wealth. But at any rate, there's no real external threat to America's freedom, and there never has been, at least not since the end of World War II, in spite of decades and decades of propaganda otherwise. So the classical analysis, whether it's from the left or from the libertarian right, is that the military buildup is really about securing foreign control, domination, global hegemony for the sake of markets and raw materials. Except when you actually look at post-World War II history, where exactly did this global American military might actually accomplish any of that? Maybe in Grenada, but they weren't successful in Cuba. They weren't successful in securing North Korea. They lost the Vietnam War. They lost in Afghanistan, in Iraq. Yes, they overthrew Saddam, but China gets even more of Iraq soil than the United States does, and the Iraqi government is at least as friendly to Iran as they are to the United States. But while these adventures ended in military and geopolitical failure, trillions of dollars flowed into the arms industry. Perhaps U.S. military power has discouraged China from unifying Taiwan, but that's not sustainable. They haven't been able to invade Venezuela to topple Maduro, not because the U.S. has some moral objections to such intervention, but they know they would face endless resistance from the Venezuelan people and the wrath of all of Latin America. So the use of this massive global military might actually hasn't even been all that successful in terms of securing raw materials and markets and asserting its hegemony. The real power of the U.S. empire is its financial sector and the power of its markets. And yes, the CIA and its covert activities. But primarily, the United States is the manager of global capitalism. And so far, that's an indispensable role. None of what I'm saying is meant to minimize the very real control the U.S. has over most of the globe. And certainly its ability to project military power plays a role in certain situations. But that said, in spite of this massive military might, China is now the leading trading partner for almost all of Latin America, Africa, even Australia, most of Asia, and China doesn't have any global military power to speak of, and still dominates many markets and sources of raw materials. So what exactly is at least $1 trillion a year of military spending accomplishing? What is the point of this enormous military power? Well, there's a new book out by Andrew Cockburn called Spoils of War, which makes the argument quite persuasively, I think, that the primary objective of all this military spending is the spending itself. It's the money-making, the profits made by the military-industrial complex, even to the extent it doesn't much matter if the weapons even work or are effective in carrying out actual military missions. Now joining us to talk about his book is Andrew Cockburn. Andrew is the Washington editor of Harper's Magazine and the author of many articles and books on national security, including the New York Times Editor's Choice, Rumsfeld, and The Threat, which destroyed the myth of Soviet military superiority underpinning the Cold War. He's a regular opinion contributor to the Los Angeles Times and has written for, amongst others, the New York Times, the National Geographic, London Review of Books, and many others. Andrew, thanks very much for joining me.
Great, Paul. Good to be with you.
So, am I missing something here? What the hell is the point of this obscene military budget?
Well, it's a very important point. I think you mentioned it in your introduction. It's $1 trillion worth of point. So, if you dangle $1 trillion in front of people or person or an institution, a system, they're going to grab at it. And that is the point. The point is not, very evidently, the point is not what we're told it is, which is, the defense of the United States, based on a very carefully considered strategy, plans and so forth. The point is to garner money and power, or the power to get more money. And this system is incredibly successful. I mean, people who deride the US military complex, the military industrial complex, whatever you want to call it, I think really do it an injustice when they say it's, can't shoot straight, it's incompetent. No, it can shoot very straight and it hits the target very effectively, and has done for years and years in the face of really some quite significant obstacles, like the occasional outbreak of peace. In 1975, the Vietnam War ended, and a very significant effort they've been putting into that. 500,000 men, vast expenditures over a huge distance. The war's over. You'd expect there to be a mammoth cost saving. Well, the budget went down briefly for a year or so and then started to climb again. So peace was not a big obstacle. Again, even more significantly, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. The enemy that had all been based on confronting the Soviet threat. That's why we were up and running in the Cold War, in the arms race in the late 1940s. Suddenly that goes away. What do? Things go latent for a few years, not to a great extent. I can explain why or how, but within a few short years, the budget is zooming up again. And now we spend more than we spent during the Cold War on average. I mean, it's quite extraordinary and quite a testament to the human resourcefulness or the resourcefulness of our defense complex.
Andrew, you talked to some of the insiders, both in the military and I'm guessing in the military-industrial complex. To what extent are they themselves conscious of the fact that most of the spending is for the sake of profit-making and has next to nothing to do with national security?
Well, if you catch them in moments of honesty, they do. I mean, really deep down, they do. You get, to a certain extent, they believe their own propaganda, that they, their careers, their fortunes, their children's college education or whatever is vested in believing something, believing in whatever it is they happen to be pushing, the wonders of precision-guided global strike, remote warfare, drone warfare. So they'll, I always wondered if I could sort of inject them with truth drugs, would they start committing truth? I'm not sure they would. I think they internalize it to such a degree. I mean, someone once told me, he said until he went to work for the Air Force, he'd never understood the communist system idea of the party line, when Stalin would, give a new instruction which contradicted what he was saying yesterday. Everyone in the global communist movement would fall into line immediately. You had to follow the party line. And then he said he went to work for the US Air Force and he saw it in action, that, the sort of the groupthink and the sort of the discipline of believing in the ideology was so firmly entrenched that they would follow it. That being said, I do find usually when you catch them when they're retired or mellowing into old age, they'll admit that what a crock it all is. But you'll see, for example, recently they crept out of or hurried out of Kabul after being defeated in the Afghan war. And their biggest complaint is that it's been called a defeat. People like H.R. McMaster, very considered for a long time the bright hope of the US Army. Then he was Trump's national security advisor. He had a piece last week basically complaining that people are saying we're defeated and how bad that is. So they don't like to be called out on their failures, but because it interrupts the money flow. I mean, that's the demand now. Is for God's sake, even though we lost that war and then one before that and the one before that, we did conquer Grenada, as you said. They don't want the money flow interrupted, so now we have the China threat to justify it.
It's one thing to sort of buy in and rationalize somehow. Troops all over the world, bases, aircraft carriers, but it's all over there. And I'm pretty sure they think to themselves, my kids aren't going to go get killed over there. So that's one thing to get your head all around. But the fact that they allow such expenditure in nuclear weapons, what is it now? Maybe $2 trillion over the next 10, 20 years, rebuilding America's nuclear might. If a nuclear war breaks out, there's no over there.
Well, it really comes back to the profit-making movement, to institutional power. I can give you the need to, maintain positions of power and influence. I'll give you, the nuclear weapons industry or effort provides a very good example of this, which is, we have the so-called triad. We have missiles that are based on land, the ICBMs, that they're about to build a new one, or they are building a new one. We have nuclear weapons on bombers, and we have nuclear missiles on submarines. Now, there's a long time ago, we had the nuclear weapons on bombers because that was our strike force, and that's how we could, if the Russians tried to attack us with nuclear weapons, we would strike back with bombers. And then we invented these missiles, so they were our retaliatory force. And we had a huge air defense network to stop the Russian bombers getting through and radars to detect the Russian missiles. Then they figured out how to fire a missile from a submerged submarine. Well, now who needs the rest of it? We can deter. This is completely invulnerable. The Russians could never find these submarines. They could never find them, period. But even in the worst case, they could never be sure of finding them. So the Russians or whoever, the Chinese, anyone, would never dare launch a nuclear attack on us because we could quite certainly retaliate from our submarines and, blow them all to pieces. So they had to think up new reasons to keep the ICBMs, particularly, and the bombers. The original rationale had gone away completely. So they they put their best minds to work to think of an excuse for having the land-based missiles. And Daniel Ellsberg can tell you more about this than I could. But that was purely because the Air Force wanted to keep that budget and all their attendant contractors. There was no other earthly reason, no rational, if you call anything to do with nuclear weapons rational, reason for maintaining this enormous and enormously expensive force in being, but keeping the money flow. That's the only reason.
To replace them while they're talking about essentially a whole other modernization of exactly those missiles.
That's right. And they're having to sort of refresh and sort of, dust off some of the old arguments for having these useless things in the first place. Interestingly, there's a sort of nuclear industrial political congressional complex. You've got the senators from the missile states of Montana and Wyoming. When there's a threat to the land-based ICBM, you see those senators rising up in righteous anger because, it's jobs, it's considered important to the economy of their states to keep these missiles in being. And by the way, to keep their population of, say, Montana or Wyoming at risk of nuclear immolation because they're there, they would obviously be targeted by an enemy, by the Russians or whoever, the Chinese, it doesn't matter. And so, they never say to the people of Montana, by the way, we're holding you up as we're enhancing your role as a nuclear target because we think the jobs it generates makes it worth it, and the campaign contributions I get from the Lockheed or the Northrop Corporation or so forth. It's never put that way, of course, but it just shows the sort of risks and the level of denial that happens when, in terms of the pursuit of, as I say, profit, money, power, and influence.
I assume their defense of these missiles is that, well, the Russians still have a lot of them, and now they're saying the Chinese are building more of them. So if they have, we've got to have it, although that's exactly the argument being used in Russia and China.
Well, yeah, they do say that, but then presumably the people in Russia and China are saying the same thing. I want to stress how incredibly dangerous this is because on the presumption that you have to be able to fire them more or less on an instant's notice because, the Russians have them targeted, and therefore if the radar and the satellites pick up signs of incoming Russian missiles, the president has to be woken up immediately and give the order to launch the land-based missiles in particular because they're so vulnerable. Which means that everything's on hair trigger alert, which means that, a slip up, and we've had near disasters in the past, can, blow us all to kingdom come because, it happened in 1979, if I remember the date right, when Zbigniew Brzezinski, President Carter's national security advisor, was woken up, or they said, we've detected Russian missiles taking off and heading our way. And then a minute later, he gets another call confirming that. And he's just about to wake up the president, who would then be very likely would have been steered to say, okay, launch ours. We'd have been off to the races when Brzezinski got another call saying, oops, sorry, we fed the wrong tape. We fed the tape of a simulated attack into the computer. Sorry about that. No, the Russian missiles aren't on their way. I mean, we came that close to nuclear catastrophe. And, that's not the only time, and certainly won't be the only time. Hopefully we'll come out of it unscathed.
How do they get their own heads around the danger of all this? Why do they seem so sure there won't be a nuclear war?
Well, look what happens at the fringes. I mean, there's an example I often cite. As part of President Obama's nuclear modernization program that he, I think, very reprehensibly, signed off on back in 2010. There was a part of it, what was slid in there was to increase our production of plutonium, or produce more plutonium pits. A plutonium pit is the core of a nuclear weapon. And these pits were to be made, or are made, at the Los Alamos nuclear laboratory in New Mexico. Now, as it so happened, there was no earthly need for these pits. I mean, even in the context of building nuclear weapons, because we already had a surplus of pits. We had more than enough to keep us going for hundreds of years. We could fight not just World War III, but World Wars 4, 5, 6, and 7 with what we have in the locker.
Let me just interject. If there is a World War III, there ain't going to be a 4, 5, 6, or 7. But I get your point.
Yeah. So anyway, there were objections raised on this basis that we didn't really need to do it. Among those who fought like a tiger to keep that appropriation in there was Tom Udall, then the U.S. Senator, one of the U.S. Senators for New Mexico. Now, Tom Udall was a very decent, liberal, progressive senator, one of the best we had. Very sad he resigned. But because, Los Alamos was part of, the New Mexico economy, a major employer in the area, he felt it, behoved him to dive in and fight for the right, the money to build more of these useless or unneeded nuclear weapons components. So that's what happens, on the fringe. Someone who, certainly doesn't believe in any of this is very. So imagine what it's like for someone of, determinedly conservative attitudes, who's, much more of whose sort of prosperity and power depends on the nuclear weapons thing. I think they have no trouble at all.
The Air Force is one of the centers of religious extremism. I guess you could say Christian nationalism. It's all in the branches of the military, apparently, but most powerfully in the Air Force. And the Air Force is STRATCOM, and that's primary control over nuclear weapons, if I understand it right. It's a pretty dangerous cocktail there of people that are cynical enough just to want to make money out of all this. And a lot of people, including apparently very senior people at the senior levels, that actually might welcome the apocalypse.
Yeah, that's something else to worry about. I mean, I do remember years ago I was addressing a meeting. I was talking about this sort of thing. And there was an Air Force colonel in uniform in the audience. This was in Texas. And he said he'd come a long way to hear me. And he said, but I should really, we were chatting away. And he said, you do know, he was complaining about science education in the US, which is, a thing anyone could complain about. And he said, you do know that there are footprints, human footprints, contemporaneous with dinosaurs. He said, it's all nonsense what they tell you about, evolution and all that. He said, if you really, creationism show, if you study creationist research, you'll find out that, human beings and dinosaurs were more or less were indeed contemporary on the Earth's surface. So I thought, oh my God. I thought, by the way, Colonel, what's your job in the Air Force? hoping he'd say, maintenance or something. And he said, "Oh, I command I command a Titan missile squadron." Now, the Titan missile at that time, it's been phased out now, but it was a missile that carried a 9-megaton warhead. I think it's the biggest warhead we've ever had on a missile. And so this lunatic was in charge of, under his direct command, he had enough to blow up, half the world. So I don't know how many people like that there are around, but I suspect a few.
The Dr. Strangelove scenario, says Daniel Ellsberg, is not outlandish, that a rogue general could launch nuclear weapons. This idea that only the president with his little briefcase can actually launch is actually not true. The ability to launch has certainly been divested at various levels. In your book, you talk about it would take for just a few people in missile silos to figure this out.
Well, right. My unfortunately late good friend Bruce Blair, who was he was a great American who really cared about this stuff and really worked for much of his life to trying to change it and help with make this threat go away. He told me this story, which I report in the book, how in the early 70s he was a launch control officer in a Minuteman silo deep under Montana. And, they actually would sit down there for days at a time when they were on duty. And so pretty boring. So he figured out what it would take, he got to know the system very well, what it would take to bypass the entire chain of command and launch. And he worked out how if he had to suborn one other, well, he'd have to either disable or enlist his fellow control officer in the silo with him. But having done that, all he would need was someone of like mind in another silo to cooperate. And together they could launch the entire wing of, I forget, 50 missiles or so. If they got if it was in the silo, the sort of command silo for the entire wing, then, if they suborned that one, then they could launch the entire US nuclear arsenal. They could send a signal, it was called Red Dot, emergency signal. It overrode everything else and just launched everything except the bombers, I believe. So there was, well over 1,000 missiles. So I said to Bruce, so you figured out how to start a nuclear war and kill a few million people. And he said, a few million? He said, a few 100 million, maybe 1 billion. So this was, and so once Bruce Blair had figured out how easy the system was to subvert and how easy it was for someone, he'd been a captain in the Air Force at that point, how a US Air Force captain or a couple of captains or lieutenants could actually blow up the world. Once he'd left the Air Force, he tried to he went to the Congress and explained the situation, and the Congress went to the committee went to the Air Force and tried to, said, what's your explanation? Can you comment on this? And the Air Force did an investigation, which they classified at a level so that even the congressional committee that had asked for the investigation couldn't see it. And furthermore, they kept the system in place. So they claim now, and Bruce thought that maybe they'd improved things in the succeeding decades, but he wasn't sure, and I'm certainly not sure. I think the situation is still hellaciously dangerous because, for going back to the point we're discussing, because the object of the exercise is not to have an efficient military that does the task assigned to it as efficiently and, in this case, as safely as possible. No, it's to enhance the power of the Air Force, enhance, in this case, the Air Force budget and the balanced bottom lines of the very many interested individuals and contractors who live off it.
Thanks for joining us, Andrew, and thank you for joining us on theAnalysis.news. And please join us again for part 2 of Andrew Cockburn. It will be coming soon. Don't forget to find his book, Spoils of War. And please, if you haven't donated yet to theAnalysis.news, we certainly can't do this without you. If you live in the United States, once again, we are a 501c3, so your donation will be tax deductible. Thanks again for watching.